In his book, The Dawn of the New Everything, Jaron Lanier, who is often called the father of virtual reality, takes a look back at his life as a VR entrepreneur in Silicon Valley in the 1980s. Lanier founded VPL Research, the first VR company to ever exist.
These are the special glasses called the iPhones you're seeing inside an imaginary world.
Luckily for us, he wasn't a nerdy, average tech guy that was only interested in ones and zeros. Lanier was an artist and a philosopher. Throughout this book, he delivers 52 unconventional definitions of immersive virtual reality. And in this video, I will present each one of them and discuss how Lanier's ideas can help us to imagine the true potential of virtual reality.
First VR definition.
A 21st century art form that will weave together the three great 20th century arts: cinema, jazz, and programming. Here, Lanier writes how VR can be an approach to a holistic form of expression and a way out of the dull persistence of physicality. It can present to us a way of being that isn't tied just to our given circumstances in the world. VR can open up a vast new creative space for humans to realize themselves technologically. Sometime later in the book, at page 43, we stumble over the second VR definition. A simulated new frontier that can evoke a grandiosity recalling the age of exploration or the Wild West. In the book here, for Lanier, this is both a compliment and a complaint. The domain of VR is a place for grandiose egos who want their names on terms and inventions, but the positive side, of course, is that VR is also a creative space that is open for exploration and invention like really no other technology. So it is exactly within this creative space that Lanier is expressing his ideas of the potential of VR, and he elaborates on this in his third VR definition. VR definition number 3. Hope for a medium that could convey dreaming. Now, notice here the word hope. Lanier's definitions refer not so much to concrete technological artifacts as they refer to ideas and potentiality of technological patterns. So Lanier writes in his book how he, in his childhood, dreamed fantastic things that were impossible to describe, and that beyond wanting to share this, he also longed to see what was inside the heads of other people. So, as he writes of the joyous potential of VR, it's not just going to be in our heads anymore. VR definition number 4. The substitution of the interface between a person and the physical environment with an interface to a simulated environment. Now, that one was a bit more down to earth, so let's move on to VR definition number 5. A mirror image of a person's sensory and motor organs, or, if you like, an inversion of a person. An inversion of a person. This is actually a good point. With VR, we have a technology that is specifically designed to be the external counterpart in terms of sensory stimulation for every part of our organism. The only objection I would have to this point is that VR alters also who we are virtually. By the virtual embodiment of avatars, our subjectivity also changes, and the virtual affects our sense of self as well, not just our surroundings. Lanier elaborates on this point in VR definition number 6, where he defines VR as an ever-growing set of gadgets that work together and match up with human sensory or motor organs. Goggles, gloves, floors that scroll so you feel like you're walking far in the virtual world, even though you remain in the same physical spot. The list will never end. Now, I think the crucial point here is that VR is not one thing, or anything concrete. In many ways, VR can be conceived of as an ever-growing ecosystem of technologies working together to immerse us in the virtual worlds through a myriad of virtual bodies. So, given this point, it's exciting to think about the ways we'll be surprised in the coming years of new technologies, but although they are new, they are still contributing to this same goal. Now, the next definition is a highly interesting one. It deals with questions such as if we'll ever fully live in VR, or if VR could ever get as highly detailed as reality itself. VR definition number 7. A coarser simulated reality fosters appreciation of the depth of physical reality in comparison. As VR progresses into the future, human perception will be nurtured by it and will learn to find ever more depth in physical reality. So, from this passage, we see that Lanier believes that VR will always be a little clumsy in comparison to unmediated reality. So, while this might sound slightly pessimistic for the average VR enthusiast, I can promise you that the rest of this piece will illustrate that he is hardly described as one doubting the power of this technology. He does, however, imagine that our brains will become better and better at detecting forgeries in simulations as a part of our exploring them. So, if this is the case or not, time will tell. Now, somewhat comparable to this seventh definition, Lanier writes that VR is a technology that rallies the brains to fill in the blanks and cover over the mistakes of a simulator in order to make a simulated reality seem better than it ought to. And I think this definition takes on an interesting point. The marvel of VR is in many ways the marvel of consciousness and experience altogether. VR technology really only gives us new input. It gives us a new virtual context for the fantastic organisms that we are to exist in. So VR then for Lanier is not really about simulating reality. In fact, it is we who forward our reality in every passing moment. VR technology merely adds new content into this synthesis. In his ninth VR definition, Lanier writes that VR can be conceived of as the investigation of the sensory motor loop that connects people with the world and the ways it can be tweaked through engineering. The investigation has no end, since people change under investigation. This is again similar to the point that human perceptual qualities will compete and get better as the technology progresses, and that the science of technological development will infinitely approach but never totally arrive at the idea of full-blown VR. Because VR does not just change our surroundings, it also changes us. VR definition number 10. Reality, from a cognitive point of view, is the brain's expectation of the next moment. In virtual reality, the brain has been persuaded to expect virtual stuff instead of real stuff for a while. This is again related to our brains filling in the blanks. Lanier writes how the nervous system is holistic. It chooses one external world at a time to believe in. From the standpoint of the philosophy of phenomenology, we would say that our intentionality is being shifted from the real world to the virtual environment, and we relate to the virtual stimulation as a world. So, a world is not a 3D environment. The worldhood of an environment is constituted as part of our relation to it. So it will be in the transaction of humans and virtuality that we get VR. VR definition number 11. VR is the most centrally situated discipline. Now, the 11th VR definition is perhaps a bit cryptic, but there is certainly sense here. Before providing this definition, Lanier writes how VR is a hard topic to explain because it's hard to contain. He writes how he throughout his career has visited departments of math, medicine, physics, journalism, art, cognitive science, government, business, cinema and more, due to his involvements in VR. So VR can be conceived of as the most centrally situated discipline because the idea is so flexible, simple, and can be adapted to simulate almost everything. VR definition number 12. VR is the technology of noticing experience itself. The point that Lanier is aiming at here is that VR provides us with new eyes. For one, we marvel at the wonders of the virtual worlds that we are in, but the effect does not end there. After adjusting our sense of reality to VR, and later to come back, we also look at our physical reality in a new light. Lanier writes, "For me, VR's greatest value is as a palate cleanser. Everyone becomes used to the most basic experiences of life and our world, and we take them for granted. Once your nervous system adapts to a virtual world, however, and then you come back, you have a chance to experience being born again in microcosm." At this point, it's time to go a bit darker. In his 13th VR definition, Lanier defines VR as the perfect tool for the perfectly evil Skinner box. So this one takes a bit more time to explain, but Lanier writes that for a long time one of his fears was that VR was the perfect tool for manipulating human beings. Skinner was a behavioral scientist who created a box for conditioning animals in laboratories, and Lanier imagines that VR can be the ultimate so-called Skinner box. So if you're interested in learning more about this, then be sure to watch our dedicated video on this definition alone. VR definition number 14. Magic tricks as applied to digital devices. So before providing his 14th VR definition here, Lanier writes how VR is like stage magic or hypnosis, meaning that the effect of VR can be attributed to the expectation or redirection of attention to virtual reality, stimulation from the virtual environment. And this is also relevant for the phenomenon of phantom touch, where the mere habitual expectation of touch and bodily identification with the avatar can bring touch into the experience. VR definition number 15. Instrumentation to make your world change into a place where it is easier to learn. So VR for learning is certainly interesting and provides the opportunity for not only realistic simulators of more dangerous or expensive tasks, but also more abstract and creative ways of learning information. And the latter points us towards the next definition. VR definition number 16. entertainment products that create illusions of another place, another body, or another logic of how the world works. So, although flying planes over the Earth is kind of cool, like in Microsoft Flight Simulator, it is just as easy to fly a spaceship over a planet thousands of light years away in virtual reality. Or you wouldn't even need a spaceship. Laws of physics only matter to the extent that we want them. And this point is again strongly related to the next definition. VR definition number 17. A general purpose simulator, as compared to special purpose ones like flight or surgical simulators. So, what Lanier is touching on in these definitions is the flexibility of virtual reality, which allows us to design new worlds with new logics, new cultures, new means of self-expression and interaction, which is what is really enticing about the power of the VR medium. It leaves so much room for exploration. Let's take a look at the two next definitions, which are quite related to each other. VR definition number 18. Instrumentation to explore the deep time of nervous system adaptations and pre-adaptations. And VR definition number 19. Instrumentation to explore motor cortex intelligence. So I believe the point that Lanier is aiming at here is that VR is a medium of the body. In order to provide great sensory feedback, our bodies must be tracked, and the medium must respond in relation to it. Already, VR is extensively used by physiotherapists and researchers for motion capture and response. Here, VR can enable the possibility of entirely new scientific experiments, through which we can learn more about our bodies. Now, the 20th VR definition is long but good. Here, Lanier writes that VR is like lucid dreaming, except that A, more than one person can take on roles in the same experience, B, the quality is not as good, and C, you have to work to program VR if you want to be in control, which you should want. Dreams, meanwhile, are often best if you don't seek to control them. Even Steven LaBerge seeks to be non-lucid in most of his dreams, since it is in untethered dreams that the brain surprises and renews itself. Okay, so there is a lot to unravel there, but for those of you who are interested in my personal comparison between lucid dreaming, that is, knowing that you are dreaming while you are dreaming and thus being present as a relatively autonomous self in the dream, we do have a dedicated piece written on this, which you can find in the description of this video. VR definition number 21. In comparison to older grandiose definitions of nanotechnology, VR lets you experience wild things without messing up the one physical world that others are compelled to share with you. VR is vastly more ethical. It's also not so nutty. We can see how VR will work without weird speculations or apparent violations of fundamental physical laws. Now, I don't know too much about nanotech, but it seems fair to assume that trying to control matter in the same way as we control virtuality might come with some risks. So, while VR will also come with risks in terms of our personal relationship to it and how we are shaped by it, I would concur with Lanier here that we should or could conceive of it as indeed vastly more ethical. VR definition number 22. A preview of what reality might be like when technology gets better someday. This one is interesting philosophically. What Lanier is getting at is that we can use VR to try out different scenarios. For instance, of how we can organize ourselves politically, culturally, or even just architecturally in terms of city planning. Here, Lanier writes, maybe VR can give us a hint about what we should want in the future as technology ramps up and people gain more and more options. We can simulate living in a Jetsons world today. Let's try and see if we really want it. Lanier writes in his 23rd VR definition, VR is sometimes compared to LSD, but VR users can share a world objectively, even if it's fantastical, while LSD users cannot. VR worlds will require design and engineering efforts and will be best when you are willing to make the effort to create and share your own experiences. It will be like riding a bike, not a roller coaster ride. Although there will be thrilling VR experiences, you'll always be able to take off the goggles. You won't lose control. VR will typically be of lower quality than reality or dreams or psychedelic trips, although it will be up to you to hone your senses so that you can notice the difference. LSD is ready now, and VR won't be really good for a while. It might be more for your kids or their kids. Well said. Both lucid dreaming and psychedelic drugs, still to this day, can feel far more real and lifelike than VR. But that there is this sober element to VR is of course also what makes it something malleable and controllable and usable in our everyday. And the quality will just keep increasing. It's already substantially better than when Lanier released this book in, I think, 2016. VR definition number 24. A cybernetic construction that measures the probing aspect of human perception so that it is cancelled out. Here we have just another formulation from another perspective. VR answers satisfactorily to our probing of the world by giving our senses appropriate stimulation. VR definition number 25. A media technology for which measurement is more important than display. Now, I think this is largely correct. No matter how simple or shitty the graphics, you still gain a sense or feeling of presence in that shitty world, if there is proper tracking that responds to your bodily movement. So, if there is proper tracking, you will feel that this is an environment, or a world, however shitty that world or environment is. If, on the other hand, the world is visually stunning, but you can't really turn around properly or investigate and probe it with your bodily explorations, you do not have access to the world as such, and it remains more like an image. VR definition number 26. A media technology that prioritizes stimulating the cognitive dynamics by which the world is perceived over accurately simulating an alternate environment. In a previous blog piece, I wrote how the nature of virtual content can be understood with the term shunyata from Buddhism. It is empty. We do not actually simulate in VR the inside workings of avatars with glands, hearts, and the function of other organs. There is no substantive matter. It is a simulation that prioritizes stimulating only what is relevant for perception of the world. That means that it is not as rich, and also that sometimes breaks in immersion can occur if the user is probing for information that the designer has not yet taken into consideration. VR definition number 27. A medium in which interactive biological motion is emphasized. So, essential to the technology of immersive VR is its capability for natural interaction, right? I mean, you walk by walking, you jump by jumping, and you turn around by turning around. So just strap a VR headset to someone's head and they grasp the hold that they have over the virtual environment intuitively through their bodily understanding. They realize that they can interact with the same virtual environment in the same way as they can with a physical environment. Some people even realize this too much and try to jump, for some reason, off a cliff, or into the TV, or run straight into the wall trying to escape from some zombies. So VR is certainly an interesting medium because it emphasizes biological motion, and VR is the medium which most closely takes the whole human organism into account in terms of interaction and response. VR definition number 28. The digital medium that fights the hardest against time. Now, here Lanier is simply remarking again the issue of tracking. For VR to keep up with us, for instance if we're trying to run a complex Beat Saber song on Expert++ or whatever, it's really down to the microseconds. So good tracking and response time is a fight against time. VR definition number 29. A cultural movement in which hackers manipulate gadgets to change the rules of causality and perception in demos. So, in delivering his 29th VR definition here, Jaron Lanier asks, how will people modify the sensory motor loop through which we know and affect our world? So, this is again turning on the essential freedom of expression, even moving towards freedom of being, that VR technologies can offer. VR technology is an existential technology because it can directly impact who we are in relation to any kind of world, and these relationships will in turn inform how we relate to the real world. So, if you're curious in delving more into this, then I can shamelessly recommend this blog piece or this journal article, which you'll also find in the description. VR definition number 30. A technology in which internal data and algorithms are intelligible as transformations of real-time point-of-view human experiences, and thus inspire curiosity to look under the hood. In many ways, VR allows us to turn our encompassing reality into variables. In software, these can be changed, and we can explore how humans react to different social scenarios, different embodiments, varying degrees of power, etc. So, VR allows us to experimentally study how we perceive experiential phenomena at all, and this is why VR research is so incredibly fascinating and full of potential. VR can be a tool for introspection as well as objective research. That is, numerous ways of looking under the hood. VR definition number 31. You are having interesting experiences, but look preposterously nerdy and dorky to onlookers. Yeah, this is an all too correct point. You may look cool inside VR, but certainly not as looked from the outside. For now, at least. VR definition number 32. The technology that is often misrepresented as being able to make so-called holograms float impossibly in the air. Now, this one is a bit oddly specific in my opinion, but Lanier writes it in the context of people he has conversed with, who misunderstood how the technology works. VR, or AR for that matter, certainly isn't the kind of holograms you would see in a sci-fi movie like Star Wars. Lanier writes, "Why is it so hard for smart people like investors and military planners to understand? It's like trying to talk people out of bogus, expensive quack medicine. Human beings love to believe in the impossible." This definition is merely a frustrated comment on how AR and VR displays work, as opposed to how the technology is sometimes portrayed in science fiction. VR definition number 33. The ultimate media technology, meaning that it is perpetually premature. Now, this is a wonderful insight. Lanier writes here, "At each step of the way, each form of VR is a medium unto itself." So when we talk about VR, we do not really talk about one technology or one medium. As a concept, as a term, it is so inclusive that it refers to navigable, interactable content in 3 dimensions. It is almost as broad of a concept as reality itself. So VR can be said to be an extreme meta-medium, as virtually all other media can be reproduced within it, including future non-existing media. Therefore, in many ways, every form of VR is its own medium. VR definition number 34. Instrumentation that might just enable telecommunications with honest signals someday. So over to the social. Before this definition, Lanier speaks of the great potential of meeting socially in VR, but also potential limitations that we are currently facing, such as the uncanny valley. Now, VR can give us the feeling of eye contact, as well as allowing us to read nonverbal cues and feel present together. We might still lack complete visual realism, and most of us do not own face trackers or full body tracking equipment, but this will be an ever-growing area that is incredibly interesting for VR, and can allow a very true form of communications that is not abstracted into emojis and text. VR definition number 35. Training simulators for anything, not just for flight. I'll let this one pass without any extra comment because it's quite self-explanatory. Let's move on to the next. VR definition number 36. A way to try out proposed changes to the real world before you commit. So, self-explanatory as well, but speaks for the great cost-reducing power of virtual reality. VR definition number 37. Instrumentation to present data as lucidly as possible. So, whether it is cultural heritage or relational models of big data, the natural interaction and navigation through 3D datasets gives an incredible amount of expressive power to the data. VR definition number 38. The ultimate way to capture someone inside an advertisement. Let's hope it is done as little as possible. Ha! Well, yeah, let's hope. At this point, I guess hoping is hardly enough, and for those who share Lanier's view here, the obvious answer is to boycott Meta, who incidentally also has understood that VR is the ultimate way to capture someone inside an advertisement. If you want to explore more critical pieces on Meta, you can watch our video, Who Will Own the Metaverse? VR definition number 39. Digital implementation of memory palaces. Now, VR memory palaces are basically a technological implementation of the ancient mnemonic, the method of loci, which is a technique that it's still used to memorize vast amounts of information. And this is done by organizing visual associations to the content that you want to remember into 3D space. So naturally, VR is the perfect medium for this kind of mnemonic device. And if you want to see an example of a VR memory palace, you can take a look at the one that I made last year. The next definition is similar, although broader. VR definition number 40. A generalized tool for cognitive enhancement. So the ways in which we will utilize VR technologies to aid in our cognitive enhancement is not yet known. I have argued in another blog piece that VR can be used to extend our minds, and VR mind palaces or memory palaces is one example here, but who knows what tools that are waiting to be discovered. VR definition number 41. A training simulator for information age warfare. So this one has a larger story in the book that is a bit complicated to repeat here, but it involves Lanier selling a product that a customer was particularly interested in whether it could also be used as off-label to track military spies. He had to admit that it would be quite good for that, but yeah, go get the book for the stories. VR definition number 42. Digital puppetry. Here, Lanier tells the story of how Jerry Garcia and his daughter Annabelle used one of VPL's data gloves and a skeletal hand from a surgical simulation project to project a giant skeletal hand during Grateful Dead concerts, which of course sounds awesome. VR definition number 43. A new form of art that must escape the clutches of gaming, cinema, traditional software, new economy power structures, and maybe even the ideas of its pioneers. Now, this one is heavy, VR technology is so novel that it breaks with much that has traditionally sedimented in our society. It will take time to reach maturity for these reasons alone. Lanier gives advice in the preceding pages to VR designers and artists, and I'll mention one of his recommendations here. Lanier advises: fight against impulses you internalized in film school. VR is not cinema. For just one example, the watcher becomes invisible in a movie, but not in VR. The navigable virtual world is less important than the body of the user. What does she see when she looks at her hand? In a mirror. If the answers are modular, that is, not central to the story, then you aren't yet designing for VR. VR definition number 44. The term you might have used in the 1980s if you were partial to those weirdos at VPL Research. So at this point in the book, Lanier addresses whether he, as many says, coined the term virtual reality. It's a longer story, but Lanier gives a good account of the history of the term and gives credit to, for instance, Susanne Langer, who coined the term virtual worlds in the 1950s. It's an interesting history read, in particular because of how he discusses his own temptations towards ego inflation in an honest way that deserves respect here. We also get a story of a regretful gold digger marriage and Lanier's rockstar fame at the time. So this is really a recommended read, which makes the book personal and, as it is, autobiographical. VR definition number 45. A person-centered experiential formulation of digital technology that hopefully inspires digital economies in which the real people who are the sources of value can't be ignored. Now this is a bit funny and a bit depressing to read in the light of Meta's announcement a couple of weeks ago that they would take a 50% cut for purchases in the metaverse. Does it smell like blockchain in here? Maybe not, but it certainly does not smell like Meta. So in the preceding passages leading to this definition, Lanier delivers a beautiful take on business strategies for information companies, which genuinely enlightened me on some of the issues of the early web. So here, for instance, Lanier writes how companies like Google and Facebook would make hundreds of billions of dollars for the service of partially mapping what should have been mapped from the start. And this is true. Right now, Facebook and Google do in many ways own the internet, as you go to Google to find web pages and Facebook to talk to your friends. So they are sort of standing in the middle and guiding all of your actions on the web, really. And Google didn't create the billions of web pages in the world. Facebook does not give birth to people or create the metaverse. So, as Lanier writes, it is the people who are the sources of the value, and when we have the chance to create a new spatial internet, there is also a chance to do things right. Although, right now, Meta is doing everything they can to stop this effort dead in its tracks already. VR definition number 46. Minus AI. VR is the inverse of AI. So this short VR definition comes with a long footnote. And instead of me expanding upon this, I'll let Lanier himself take the word as he elaborates in his footnote. A related formulation is that AI is like VR, but with time and space exchanged. For instance, a person might appear to turn into a lobster, but is still interacting with other people and everything else about the environment in real time. When it comes to an AI, however, data is gathered from people and then mapped and role-played through supposed AI personalities at a later time. An AI entity is a non-real-time avatar. Fascinating perspective. VR definition number 47. The science of comprehensive illusion. Now, again, I'll leave the illuminating point to Jaron, who writes, VR scientists are the illusionists of science. We are honest when we tell you we are fooling you, and you should take us seriously when we point out that we are not the only ones. VR definition number 48. A shared waking state, intentional, communicative, collaborative dream. This one Lanier extends upon, or puts another way, as he writes, in the next VR definition, number 49. The technology that extends the intimate magic of earliest childhood into adulthood. And yeah, this is a beautiful definition that I believe many VR enthusiasts would subscribe upon. There is, with VR technology, this sense of magic and discovery, of standing against untrodden terrain, ready for exploration and surprises. So, when we were younger, the world was new and the possibilities were open. And we might be a bit older now, but is your virtual self old? VR has this capability to rekindle some of this magic, and I think we need it. VR definition number 50. A hint of the experience of life without all the limitations that have always defined personhood. VR chat, anyone? In terms of who we are and how we identify, how we represent ourselves, VR is a very fascinating technology. Our representation is entirely up for redefining. So VR chat, for instance, can be conceived of as a collective experiment into exactly this, breaking the limitations of personhood. You can use an avatar with a different expression in terms of gender, age, race, etc. In fact, you do not even need to be a human being. Hello, furries. So this is freeing for a lot of people, and many report that they're able to explore their own identity in a more controlled environment. It will be interesting to see the effects that this has on society in the long term, for better and for worse. VR definition number 51. The medium that can put you in someone else's shoes. Hopefully a path to increased empathy. So VR has indeed been called an empathy machine. We can experience the situated standpoint of someone who is not us, and hopefully this leads to increased empathy. There are some culprits here which I mentioned in this journal article published in Frontiers of VR. You can find that in the description. And more research is needed into the potential pitfalls in trying to achieve this. That being said, being able to take in other accounts of you is a feature of VR that has great potential. VR definition number 52. A way of using computers that suggests a rejection of the idea of code. With VR, we are to a lesser extent designing something that looks like an interface. While there is a front end and a back end in VR nonetheless, what we are designing is coming to life as a world. This prompts a reconsideration of traditional notions of thinking around software development. Virtual worlds are not just utility. We might spend an increasing amount of our life there. It is something that we exist within. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed this, then please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking the notification bell so that you actually get notified when we release new content. And yeah, we have a lot of other stuff at this YouTube channel too. We do our own experimental VR developments. We have, for instance, used virtual reality in sensory deprivation tanks, recreated my apartment in VR so that you can actually walk between rooms and lay down on the couch and so on. And we have used virtual reality with drones to film ourselves or see ourselves in third person in real life. And we create virtual reality mind palaces like we talked about, for instance, with brain-computer interfacing. So if this is something for you, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you.